I'll never forget the smug satisfaction in his eyes as he leaned back in that oversized leather chair. "Effective immediately, you're terminated from Cooper Construction," Franklin Cooper announced, fingers drummed against his mahogany desk like he was conducting some twisted symphony. "Maybe losing this job will finally teach you some respect for family hierarchy, Felicity. A woman's place isn't challenging her father-in-law's business decisions." My hands trembled as I stared at the man who'd become my worst nightmare, my husband's father, my former boss, and now the architect of my professional destruction. 3 years I'd given his company, 3 years of 60-hour weeks and missed family dinners, only to be fired because I dared to question his outdated methods in front of the board, but Franklin Cooper had no idea what he'd just unleashed. He thought firing me would break my spirit, force me to fall in line like the obedient daughter-in-law he'd always wanted. Instead, he'd just given me the motivation to destroy everything he'd built. Within 18 months, I'd own his biggest competitor, and Franklin would learn exactly what respect really meant, the hard way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The clock on Franklin Cooper's office wall read 4:47 p.m. when my world collapsed. I'd been called into his corner office at Cooper Construction's headquarters in Millbrook Heights, thinking we were going to discuss the Westfield Shopping Center project, the biggest contract our company had landed in 5 years. Instead, I found myself staring at a termination letter with my name typed across the top in cold, corporate font. "Your performance has been disappointing lately," Franklin continued, not even bothering to look at me as he spoke. His attention remained fixed on his computer screen, as if firing his own daughter-in-law was just another mundane task on his daily agenda. "The board has lost confidence in your ability to represent Cooper Construction's values." I felt my cheeks burn with a mixture of rage and humiliation. My performance? "Franklin, I brought in 3 major contracts this quarter alone. The Henderson Office Complex, the Rosewood Residential Development, and the Westfield project that's sitting on your desk right now, projects that required significant corrections. And oversight," he interrupted, finally turning his steely gray eyes toward me. "Projects where you consistently overstepped your authority and questioned established protocols." The lie hit me like a physical blow. Every one of those projects had been delivered ahead of schedule and under budget. The Westfield contract alone was worth $2.3 million to the company, and I'd spent months nurturing that client relationship from a cold lead to a signed deal. "Established protocols?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "You mean like using outdated building techniques that cost 30% more than industry standard? Or refusing to implement digital project management systems that every other construction company adopted 5 years ago?" Franklin's jaw tightened, the same expression I'd seen countless times when someone dared to challenge his old-school methods. "That's exactly the kind of disrespectful attitude I'm talking about, Felicity. You seem to have forgotten that this is my company, built with my vision and my methods. Methods that have worked successfully for over 20 years. I glanced through the glass wall of his office and saw Esther Clark, our head of HR, hovering near her desk. Her eyes met mine briefly before she looked away, her expression a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. Behind her, I could see several other employees pretending to be absorbed in their work while clearly listening to every word coming from Franklin's office. "This is about last week's board meeting, isn't it?" I said, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. When I presented the cost analysis showing how modernizing our processes could increase profit margins by 25%. Franklin's smile was razor-thin and entirely without warmth. "That presentation was illuminating. It showed me exactly where your priorities lie. You seem more interested in impressing our board members than in respecting the chain of command." "The chain of command?" I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. "Franklin, I'm the senior project manager. Presenting efficiency improvements is literally part of my job description. Your job description is to implement my directives, not to undermine my authority in front of investors," he snapped, his composure finally cracking. "You embarrassed me in that boardroom, Felicity. Made me look like some doddering old man who doesn't understand modern business. And there it was, the real reason. Not my performance, not my qualifications, not my results. Franklin Cooper was firing me because I'd made him look outdated in front of people whose opinions mattered to him. Because I dared to suggest that his 20-year-old methods might not be the best way to run a construction company in 2024. I was trying to help the company," I said, hating how small my voice sounded. Every suggestion I made was backed up with data and industry research. "Help?" Franklin laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to help? Here's how you can help. Take this as a learning experience. Marriage is about partnership, and partnership requires understanding your role. Christopher deserves a wife who supports her family, not one who creates conflict at every opportunity. The mention of my husband hit like a sucker punch. Christopher, Franklin's son, who had sat silently at that board meeting while I presented my findings. Who had nodded along with the investors when they expressed interest in my proposals. Who hadn't said a single word in my defense when his father began dismissing my ideas as impractical and unnecessarily complicated. Does Christopher know you're firing me? I asked. Franklin's smile returned, colder than before. Christopher understands the importance of family loyalty. He agrees that this separation will be beneficial for everyone involved. My heart sank. Christopher knew. Not only did he know, but he supported it. My own husband had thrown me under the bus to avoid confronting his father. I've already had Esther prepare your final paycheck, Franklin continued, sliding an envelope across his desk. You'll find it's quite generous, 2 weeks severance plus your accrued vacation time. More than fair, considering the circumstances. I stared at the envelope like it was a venomous snake. 2 weeks severance for 3 years of dedicated service. For the contracts I'd brought in, the relationships I'd built, the late nights I'd spent making sure every project exceeded client expectations. Security will escort you out, Franklin added, pressing a button on his desk phone. I trust you'll handle this transition with dignity. Within minutes, Byron King from building security appeared at the office door. I'd known Byron for 3 years. He'd always been friendly, asking about my weekend plans or commenting on the latest sports scores. Now he couldn't meet my eyes as he waited to walk me out of the building like a common criminal. My personal items, I began, will be boxed up and mailed to you, Franklin finished. We'll handle everything professionally. As I stood to leave, Franklin called my name one last time. Felicity? I turned back, hoping against hope that he might have changed his mind, that this was all some twisted test or misunderstanding. Remember, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a threat disguised as advice, Millbrook Heights is a small community. Word travels fast in the construction industry. I'd hate for future employers to hear that you left Cooper Construction on difficult terms. The message was crystal clear: comply quietly, or he'd make sure I never worked in construction again. I walked out of that office with my head held high, but inside, I was crumbling. 3 years of my life, dismissed with a handwritten termination letter and a thinly veiled threat. As Byron escorted me through the lobby, past colleagues who suddenly found their computer screens fascinating, I felt like I was walking through a nightmare. But Franklin Cooper had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed that firing me would break my spirit, force me to retreat into the role of the obedient, supportive wife he thought I should be. He had no idea that he'd just declared war on the wrong woman. As the elevator doors closed behind me, cutting off my view of Cooper Construction forever, I made a silent promise. Franklin Cooper wanted to teach me about respect? Fine. I was about to give him a masterclass in what respect really looked like, and it was going to cost him everything. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled Franklin Cooper's empire piece by piece, I need to ask you something. Please, take a moment right now and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. This story, what I'm about to share with you, it took me 2 years to find the courage to tell publicly, knowing that it's reaching people around the world. Knowing that there might be someone out there who needs to hear this, someone who's sitting in their car right now after being humiliated by a boss or family member who thinks they hold all the power. That would mean everything to me, because here's the thing about stories like mine, they're not just entertainment. They're proof. Proof that the people who try to crush your spirit, who think their authority makes them untouchable, who believe they can rewrite your worth and your future, they're wrong. I'm sharing this not because I want sympathy, and definitely not because I want to relive the darkest period of my marriage and career. I'm sharing this because what happened next, what I did next, changed not just my life, but the entire construction industry landscape in Millbrook Heights. And if my story can inspire even one person to stand up to someone who's trying to diminish them, then every uncomfortable moment of telling it will be worth it. So please, comment below. Tell me where you're from. Tell me if you've ever had someone in a position of power try to put you in your place. Tell me if you've ever felt that burning sensation in your chest when someone dismisses your contributions, your intelligence, your right to be heard, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about a father-in-law who thought he could teach his daughter-in-law a lesson. This is about what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness, when they confuse compliance with incompetence, and when they make the fatal error of thinking that firing someone will make them disappear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I want you to understand something before we go any further. I wasn't always the person who could do what you're about to hear. 18 months before that day in Franklin's office, I was exactly the daughter-in-law he wanted: quiet, supportive, grateful for the opportunity to work at the family business. I attended company barbecues and smiled when Franklin told stories about the good old days when women knew their place. I laughed politely when he made jokes about how construction sites were no place for a lady, while I stood there with my engineering degree and 3 years of flawless project management. I kept my mouth shut when he shot down my suggestions in meetings, only to present the exact same ideas weeks later as his own brilliant insights. I bit my tongue when he introduced me to clients as Christopher's wife instead of our senior project manager. I played the role he'd written for me because I thought that was what family meant: sacrifice, compromise, keeping the peace. But that day, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the casual cruelty in his voice when he said, "a woman's place." Maybe it was the realization that my own husband had sat silent while his father destroyed my career. Or maybe it was simply that I'd reached the breaking point that every person has, that moment when you realize that being smaller to make someone else feel bigger isn't kindness, it's self-destruction. The story I'm about to tell you spans 18 months. 18 months of careful planning, strategic moves, and yes, revenge. But not the petty, destructive kind that leaves everyone worse off. This is the kind of revenge that's really about justice, about proving that competence and integrity will always triumph over nepotism and ego. I want to be completely transparent with you about what's coming. This isn't a story where I suddenly discovered I had a trust fund or where a mysterious benefactor appeared to fund my comeback. This is about using intelligence, patience, and an understanding of the industry that Franklin Cooper had underestimated. This is about building something better from the ground up while watching someone who thought they were untouchable learn that actions have consequences. There will be moments in this story where you might think I went too far. There will be times when you might feel sorry for Franklin, when his downfall might seem excessive compared to what he did to me. But I want you to remember that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. As you'll learn, Franklin Cooper had a 20-year history of crushing anyone who threatened his authority, of pushing out talented people who made him feel inadequate. What I did wasn't just for me. It was for every person who'd ever been told they weren't smart enough, experienced enough, or frankly, male enough to contribute meaningfully to a family business. It was for every daughter-in-law who'd been expected to be grateful for scraps from the table instead of claiming their rightful seat. The construction industry in Millbrook Heights was about to learn that the quiet woman they'd written off as just the boss's daughter-in-law had been paying attention. I'd been learning. I'd been planning, and I was about to show them exactly what respect looked like when it was earned instead of demanded. So buckle up, because this story gets intense. It gets strategic. And yes, it gets deeply, satisfyingly dramatic. Because sometimes, the underdog doesn't just win. Sometimes, they completely change the game. Hit that like button if you're ready for this journey. And let's dive into exactly how a fired daughter-in-law brought down a construction empire and built something even better in its place. I should probably introduce myself properly. My name is Felicity Adams, though most people in the construction industry know me now as the woman who turned Millbrook Heights upside down. But before all of this happened, before the boardroom confrontations and the corporate warfare, I was just a 28-year-old civil engineer trying to build a career in a male-dominated industry. I grew up in Thornfield, a small town about 2 hours north of Millbrook Heights, where my father was a high school math teacher and my mother ran the local library. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, and more importantly, my parents taught me that hard work and integrity would always be rewarded. They saved every penny to send me to engineering school at State University, where I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in civil engineering and a minor in business administration. I chose construction because I loved the idea of building things that would last, creating structures that would serve communities for generations. There's something deeply satisfying about seeing a blueprint transform into a physical reality, about solving complex logistical problems and watching a team come together to create something meaningful. My first job out of college was with a mid-sized firm in the capital city, where I spent 2 years learning the ins and outs of commercial construction. I worked on everything from office buildings to shopping centers, and I was good at it. Really good. I had a natural ability to see potential problems before they became expensive disasters, and I could communicate complex technical concepts to clients in ways they could understand and appreciate. But the capital was expensive, and the company culture was toxic in that subtle way that wears you down slowly. Long hours were expected, work-life balance was laughed at, and advancement seemed to depend more on who you drank with after hours than on the quality of your work. I was burning out fast when I met Christopher Wilson at a construction industry conference in Millbrook Heights. Christopher was charming in an understated way, tall, with gentle brown eyes and an easy smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He wasn't the flashiest guy at the conference, but he was the one who asked thoughtful questions during presentations and who seemed genuinely interested in my perspective on sustainable building practices. When he told me he was the operations manager at Cooper Construction, I was impressed. I'd heard of Cooper Construction. They had a solid reputation in the region for commercial and residential projects, and they'd been in business for over 2 decades. When he mentioned that they were looking for a project manager with fresh ideas and strong technical skills, I was intrigued. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant in downtown Millbrook Heights, where Christopher told me about his vision for modernizing Cooper Construction. He talked about implementing new technologies, improving efficiency, and building a company culture that valued innovation and collaboration. He seemed frustrated by some of the old-school approaches at the company, but confident that change was coming. "My father started this company with nothing but determination and a pickup truck," he said over dinner. "He built something amazing, but sometimes I think he's resistant to change because he's afraid it means his way wasn't good enough. I keep telling him that evolution isn't criticism, it's growth." I fell for Christopher's vision before I fell for Christopher himself. Here was someone who understood the industry's potential for positive change, who wanted to build something that honored the past while embracing the future. When he offered me a position as senior project manager at Cooper Construction 6 months later, it felt like destiny. The salary was better than what I was making in the capital, and Millbrook Heights was a charming mid-sized city with affordable housing and a growing economy. More importantly, Cooper Construction seemed like a place where I could really make a difference, where my ideas would be valued and my career could flourish. I should have paid more attention to the warning signs during my interview process. Franklin Cooper was impressive in that old-school way, a man who commanded attention when he walked into a room, who spoke with the confidence of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. He had silver hair that was always perfectly styled, expensive suits that fit like they were custom-made, and a handshake that could crush bones. During my interview, he spent most of the time talking about the company's history and his philosophy of business. "Cooper Construction isn't just a company," he told me, leaning back in that same leather chair where he'd fire me 3 years later. "It's a legacy. Everything we do reflects on the Cooper name, and I expect every employee to understand the weight of that responsibility." He asked me a few technical questions, but mostly he seemed interested in whether I understood the Cooper way of doing things. I nodded enthusiastically, eager to be part of something with such strong values and traditions. "Christopher speaks very highly of you," Franklin said near the end of the interview. "He says you're intelligent, hardworking, and respectful. Those are qualities we value here." I walked out of that interview feeling like I'd found my professional home. The starting salary was generous, the benefits were excellent, and I'd be working on significant projects with a team that had decades of combined experience. When Christopher and I got engaged 8 months later, it felt like everything in my life was perfectly aligned. The wedding was beautiful, a classic ceremony at Millbrook Heights' historic Riverside Church, followed by a reception at the elegant Grandview Manor. Franklin paid for everything, insisting that Cooper weddings should reflect the family's standing in the community. During his toast at the reception, he welcomed me to the Cooper family, and I felt genuinely moved by his apparent acceptance. "Felicity brings fresh energy and new perspectives to our family," he said, raising his champagne glass. "I look forward to watching her grow into the woman Christopher deserves." At the time, I thought it was a lovely sentiment. Looking back, I can see the subtle warning embedded in those words. I needed to grow into the woman Christopher deserved, not simply be accepted for who I already was. My first year at Cooper Construction was everything I'd hoped for. I was assigned to manage the renovation of Millbrook Heights' historic downtown district, a complex project that required coordinating with city planners, historic preservation specialists, and multiple contractors. It was exactly the kind of challenging, high-visibility work I dreamed of doing. I threw myself into the project with everything I had. I arrived at the office by 7 a.m. every morning and rarely left before 7 p.m. I spent weekends visiting project sites, reviewing blueprints, and building relationships with subcontractors. I learned the names of every worker on every crew, and I made sure they knew their contributions were valued and recognized. The downtown renovation was completed 2 weeks ahead of schedule and came in 15% under budget. The city council was so impressed that they specifically requested Cooper Construction for their next major project. Local newspapers ran stories about the stunning transformation of the historic district, and 3 other municipalities reached out about similar projects. Franklin was pleased with the results, but I noticed that when he spoke to clients or reporters about the project, my role was consistently minimized. I was part of the team or one of our capable project managers, never the lead architect of the project's success. When I mentioned this to Christopher, he told me not to worry about it. "Dad's old-fashioned about recognition," he said. He believes the company's success is more important than individual credit. Don't take it personally. I tried to follow Christopher's advice, but it became harder as the pattern repeated itself. Every successful project I managed became a Cooper construction success, with no mention of my specific contributions. Every innovation I implemented was later described as Franklin's initiative. When I brought in new clients through networking and relationship building, they became long-standing Cooper construction relationships. Meanwhile, I watched male colleagues receive public recognition for much smaller accomplishments. David Moore, who'd been hired as a junior project manager 6 months after me, was featured in the local business journal after completing a simple office renovation that came in barely on time and slightly over budget. Stanley Green, who managed equipment purchasing, was praised by Franklin during company meetings for keeping our operations running smoothly, despite the fact that I'd identified and solved 3 major supply chain inefficiencies that saved the company thousands of dollars, but I told myself that success was its own reward. I was learning, growing, and building a reputation as a capable professional. I was part of a family business that was thriving, and I was married to a man I loved who shared my values and ambitions. I could be patient about recognition if the work itself was fulfilling. The second year brought bigger projects and more responsibility. I was assigned to manage the construction of Oakdale Medical Center's new wing, a $4.2 million project that would expand their emergency services and add 50 new patient rooms. It was the largest project I'd ever managed, and I was determined to prove that Franklin's faith in me was justified. The medical center project was a masterclass in complex project management. I had to coordinate with medical equipment specialists, ensure compliance with strict healthcare regulations, and manage a timeline that couldn't afford delays since the existing emergency services were operating at capacity. I worked 18-hour days for months, personally overseeing every detail from foundation work to the installation of specialized ventilation systems. When we completed the project 3 weeks ahead of schedule and 8% under budget, the hospital administration was so impressed that they offered Cooper Construction an exclusive contract for all their future expansion projects. It was a deal worth potentially millions of dollars over the next decade. At the completion ceremony, Franklin spoke to the gathered crowd of hospital administrators, city officials, and local media. He talked about Cooper Construction's commitment to community healthcare and their pride in delivering exceptional results. He mentioned the dedicated team that had made the project possible and thanked the skilled professionals who had worked tirelessly to meet every deadline. My name was never mentioned. That night, I went home to our small house in Millbrook Heights, Maple Ridge neighborhood, the starter home Christopher and I had bought with dreams of upgrading once our careers advanced. I sat in our modest kitchen, looking at the local newspaper's coverage of the medical center opening, searching for any acknowledgement of my role in what had been the most challenging and successful project of my career. Christopher found me there. An hour later, still staring at the newspaper. "You okay?" he asked, sitting down beside me. "Do you think your father is embarrassed by me?" I asked. "By my work?" Christopher looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about? Dad thinks you're great. He's always telling people how lucky we are to have you on the team. Then why doesn't he ever mention my name when he talks about projects I've managed? Why am I always just the team or our staff?" Christopher was quiet for a moment, and I could see him thinking carefully about his response. "Dad comes from a different generation," he finally said. "He believes that promoting individual team members can create jealousy and division. He thinks it's better to celebrate the company's success as a whole." But David got featured in the business journal for a project that was half the size and complexity of anything I've managed. "David specifically asked for that feature," Christopher said. "He pitched the story to them himself. Maybe you should be more proactive about promoting your own work." I stared at my husband, this man I loved and trusted, and realized that he genuinely didn't understand why this bothered me. In his mind, I should be grateful for good projects and steady advancement. Recognition was something you had to chase, not something you earned through exceptional work. That was the moment I should have started planning my exit strategy. Instead, I decided to be more proactive, as Christopher had suggested. I started documenting my contributions more carefully, speaking up more assertively in meetings, and making sure my successes were impossible to ignore. It was the beginning of the end of my marriage to both Christopher and Cooper Construction. Because Franklin Cooper didn't want a daughter-in-law who was proactive about her achievements. He wanted one who was grateful for the opportunity to serve the family legacy, and I was about to learn exactly how far he'd go to put me back in my place, but Franklin had severely underestimated the woman he was trying to diminish. Because while I'd been quietly building projects and managing teams, I'd also been quietly building something else, a deep understanding of the construction industry in Millbrook Heights, including its weaknesses, opportunities, and most importantly, Its biggest competitor, Taylor Enterprises, had been Cooper Construction's main rival for over a decade, and I was about to learn everything I could about them. Because sometimes the best way to teach someone about respect is to show them what they lost when they decided you weren't worth keeping. Let me tell you the real story about Franklin Cooper, the man behind the polished facade, the carefully cultivated image, and the power he wielded like a weapon against anyone who dared to threaten his authority. Franklin Cooper was 59 years old when he fired me, a man who had built his entire identity around being the undisputed king of Millbrook Heights construction. But here's what most people didn't know about Franklin's rise to power: it wasn't built on innovation, superior service, or even exceptional business acumen. It was built on systematically destroying anyone who could potentially outshine him. Franklin came from money, not old money, but the kind of wealth that bought influence and opened doors. His father, Kinsley King Cooper, had owned 3 successful lumber yards across the region before selling them in the 1980s for what would be worth about $15 million today. When Franklin graduated from college with a business degree and 0 real-world experience, Daddy's money bought him his first construction crew and his first few contracts. But here's the thing about Franklin: he was smart enough to understand that inherited wealth wouldn't sustain a construction business indefinitely. He needed to build a reputation, establish relationships, and most importantly, eliminate any competition that might expose his limitations. So he developed a system, a methodical approach to maintaining his position that had worked flawlessly. For over 20 years, the system was simple: identify threats early, neutralize them quickly, and make sure everyone else learned the lesson. In the early days, Franklin's biggest threat was Rogers Gus, a brilliant architect who had started his own small firm in Millbrook Heights around the same time Franklin launched Cooper Construction. Rogers was everything Franklin wasn't: technically gifted, creative, and genuinely respected by his peers. He was winning contracts that Franklin felt should have been his, and worse, clients were starting to specifically request Rogers' innovative designs. So Franklin declared war, but not in any way that could be traced back to him. He started by spreading rumors about Rogers' reliability, suggesting to mutual acquaintances that Rogers was taking on more work than he could handle. When that didn't slow Rogers down, Franklin escalated. He convinced 2 of his established clients to demand penalty clauses in any contracts with Rogers that were so severe they would bankrupt the small firm if any project ran even a day over schedule. The final blow came when Franklin learned that Rogers was competing for the design contract on Millbrook Heights' new City Hall, a prestige project that would establish whoever won it as the premier architectural firm in the region. Franklin used his family's political connections to ensure that the contract specifications were written in a way that effectively disqualified Rogers' firm. The requirements suddenly included previous experience with municipal buildings over a certain size, specific bonding capacity that Rogers couldn't meet, and a timeline that favored established firms over innovative newcomers. Rogers never knew what hit him. His firm folded within 2 years, and he eventually left Millbrook Heights to take a job with a larger firm 3 states away. Franklin had successfully eliminated his most talented competitor, and he'd done it so skillfully that most people thought Rogers had simply failed to adapt to the market. This became Franklin's template for the next 2 decades, when Joshua Williams, a young project manager with Cooper Construction, started receiving recognition for implementing cost-saving innovations. Franklin promoted him to a position that kept him away from client contact and then gradually reassigned his innovations to other team members. When Joshua finally quit in frustration, Franklin spread the word that he'd been difficult to work with and unable to handle increased responsibility. When Megan Smith, a talented engineer, joined the company and immediately impressed clients with her technical expertise, Franklin began excluding her from important meetings and then criticized her for being out of touch with project developments. When she started documenting these instances and requesting clarification of her role, Franklin labeled her combative and not a good cultural fit. She lasted 8 months, when Andrew Jackson, a charismatic sales manager, brought in 3 major contracts in his first year. Franklin restructured the sales department to eliminate Andrew's position and distribute his accounts among existing staff. Andrew was given the choice of accepting a significant demotion or leaving the company. He chose to leave, and Franklin made sure that every construction company in the region knew that Andrew had been unable to meet Cooper Construction's high standards. Over 20 years, Franklin had perfected this system. He had an uncanny ability to identify exactly what made each person valuable, and then systematically undermine those qualities while making it look like the person was failing on their own. He was particularly ruthless with anyone who showed independent thinking, creative problem-solving, or, God forbid, leadership potential that might rival his own. But Franklin's most insidious talent was his ability to make his victims complicit in their own destruction. He was a master of gaslighting, of making people doubt their own perceptions and blame themselves for their failures. He would praise someone's work privately while undermining them publicly, creating a confusing dynamic where the victim was never quite sure if they were succeeding or failing. The pattern was always the same. Franklin would identify someone's greatest strength, find a way to turn it into a liability, and then act like he was doing them a favor by pointing out their areas for improvement. If you were detail-oriented, he'd call you obsessive and unable to see the big picture. If you were innovative, he'd label you disruptive and resistant to established protocols. If you were confident, he'd paint you as arrogant and not a team player. And it worked, again and again, because Franklin had built a network of allies who either benefited from his system or were too intimidated to challenge it. The Millbrook Heights construction industry was small enough that Franklin's opinion carried weight, and he'd cultivated relationships with key clients, city officials, and industry leaders who trusted his judgment about personnel matters. Franklin's power extended far beyond Cooper Construction. He served on the board of the Millbrook Heights Chamber of Commerce, was a major donor to 3 city council members' campaigns, and belonged to the exclusive Millbrook Country Club where he regularly played golf with the mayor, the head of the planning commission, and the owners of the region's largest development firms. When Franklin wanted to destroy someone's reputation, he didn't have to work very hard. A casual comment over lunch about someone being difficult to work with would somehow make its way through the industry grapevine. A suggestion that someone might not be the right fit for a particular project would mysteriously influence hiring decisions across the region. The most sickening part about Franklin's system was how he framed it. He never admitted to deliberately undermining people. In his mind, he was simply maintaining standards, protecting his company's reputation, and ensuring that only the most qualified people succeeded. He genuinely believed that his ability to identify and eliminate problematic employees was a testament to his leadership skills. "I have an eye for character," he would tell people. "I can spot someone who's going to cause problems long before they become a real issue." That's why Cooper Construction has maintained such high standards for over 20 years. Franklin had convinced himself that he was the victim in these situations, that ungrateful employees were constantly trying to take advantage of his generosity, challenge his authority, and disrupt the harmonious culture he'd worked so hard to build. In his version of events, he was always the reasonable one, the patient mentor who gave people every opportunity to succeed before reluctantly concluding that they weren't Cooper Construction material. The scariest thing about Franklin Cooper wasn't his cruelty, it was his complete lack of self-awareness about that cruelty. He genuinely believed he was a benevolent leader, a pillar of the community, and a mentor to young professionals. He saw himself as someone who had earned his success through hard work and good judgment, and anyone who failed to thrive under his leadership was simply proving their own inadequacy. This delusion was reinforced by the carefully curated environment he'd created around himself. His remaining employees were either true believers who bought into his narrative completely, or people who were too afraid to voice any disagreement. His social circle consisted of people who benefited from his influence or who shared his worldview. About hierarchy, respect, and natural leadership, Franklin Cooper had spent 20 years building a kingdom where he was the unquestioned ruler, where his word was law, and where anyone who challenged his authority was swiftly and thoroughly destroyed. He'd grown so accustomed to this power that he'd forgotten it was possible for someone to fight back effectively. He'd eliminated every serious threat to his dominance, crushed every person who dared to outshine him, and convinced himself that his methods were not only justified but admirable. He'd built a reputation as a successful businessman, a community leader, and a family man who valued tradition and stability, but Franklin had made one critical error in his decades of systematic character assassination. He'd never faced someone who had nothing left to lose and the resources to fight back on equal terms. He'd never encountered someone who could see his system for what it really was and who had the intelligence, patience, and determination to turn it against him. He'd built his entire empire on the assumption that he would always be the most powerful person in any conflict, that his connections and influence would always be enough to destroy anyone who challenged him. He'd grown so comfortable in his role as the crusher of dreams that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable. Franklin Cooper thought he was teaching me about respect when he fired me. What he actually did was hand me the blueprint for his own destruction. Because while he'd been building his kingdom of fear and intimidation, I'd been quietly learning how every piece of his empire actually worked, and I was about to show him what happened when someone turned his own methods against him with surgical precision. The king of Millbrook Heights Construction was about to learn that every empire eventually falls, and sometimes it falls to someone they never saw coming. The first message came just 3 days after I was fired, while I was still processing the shock and trying to figure out what to do next. It was from Nicole White, a project coordinator who had worked closely with me on the Westfield Shopping Center project. "Felicity, I need to tell you something," her text read. "Can we meet?" "Not anywhere public. Franklin's been watching everyone who talks to you." We met at a small coffee shop 2 towns over, where Nicole looked genuinely frightened as she glanced around the nearly empty cafe before speaking. "He's telling clients that you were terminated for ethical violations," she whispered, sliding a printed email across the table. "Look at this," he sent it to the Westfield project managers yesterday. I read the email with growing horror. Franklin had written to the client, explaining that there had been personnel changes on their project due to concerns about professional conduct and project integrity. He assured them that Cooper Construction maintained the highest standards, and that the project would continue under his direct supervision to ensure proper protocols were followed. "Ethical violations?" I said, my voice barely controlled. "Nicole, you worked with me every day on that project." "You know I know," she interrupted. "Everyone knows. But he's not stopping there." She pulled out her phone and showed me a screenshot of an internal company email. "He sent this to all staff yesterday." The email was titled "Professional Standards Reminder" and contained a thinly veiled warning about former employees who might try to contact current staff to spread misinformation about their departure. It reminded all employees that they had signed confidentiality agreements and that sharing proprietary information with external parties could result in immediate termination. "He's making sure no one will talk to you," Nicole explained. "People are scared, Felicity." Byron from security said Franklin pulled him aside and asked him to report if anyone was seen talking to you or if you tried to contact anyone from the office. My hand shook as I handed her phone back. This wasn't just about firing me. Franklin was systematically destroying my professional reputation and isolating me from everyone who could vouch for my work. "There's more," Nicole continued reluctantly. "Esther from HR called a meeting with all the women on staff. She said there had been concerns raised about workplace dynamics and that everyone needed to be more careful about maintaining professional relationships. The whole thing felt like a warning, like we were being told not to support you." I stared at her across the table, pieces of a larger picture beginning to form. "What about my projects? Who's taking over?" Nicole looked uncomfortable. "That's the thing. Franklin announced that he'll be personally overseeing all your former accounts. He told the team that you'd been overwhelmed by the complexity of managing multiple projects and that he should have intervened sooner." The lie hit me like a physical blow. Overwhelmed? I had never missed a deadline, never gone over budget, never had a single client complaint in 3 years. But the Westfield project alone requires, I began, constant coordination with 6 different subcontractors, weekly client meetings, and daily quality control checks, Nicole finished. "I know. We all know. But Franklin's telling everyone that he was already handling most of the critical decisions, and that the transition will be seamless." I spent the rest of that week in a daze, trying to understand the scope of what Franklin was doing. But Nicole's revelation was just the beginning. Over the next 10 days, I received carefully worded messages from 5 other Cooper Construction employees, each one more disturbing than the last. Elizabeth Campbell from accounting reached out through a friend of a friend to let me know that Franklin had requested detailed records of all vendor payments I had approved over the past year. "He's looking for anything he can use to support his narrative," she warned. He specifically asked about any payments that might look questionable to an outside observer. Jennifer Collins, one of the junior engineers, managed to get word to me that Franklin had called a department meeting where he discussed red flags that everyone should watch for in project management. According to Jennifer's secondhand account, Franklin had used my approach to client relations as an example of someone who was too focused on personal relationships and not focused enough on company procedures. But the most devastating information came from Matthew Anderson, a site supervisor who had worked on multiple projects with me. He sent a cryptic message asking me to meet him at a construction site across town after hours. When I arrived, Matthew was pacing nervously beside his truck, clearly struggling with whatever he wanted to tell me. "I wasn't going to get involved," he said without preamble. "I've got 3 kids and a mortgage, and I can't afford to lose this job. But what Franklin's doing, it's not right." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "He's rewriting history on your projects," Matthew said. "Yesterday, he called a meeting with all the site supervisors and showed us documentation of problems with your project management. Except the problems he's describing never happened." Matthew pulled out his phone and showed me photos of documents. "Look at this." He's got incident reports claiming that the Rosewood residential project had repeated delays due to poor coordination, and that you failed to respond appropriately to contractor concerns. But I was the site supervisor on that project, Felicity. We finished 2 weeks early, and you were on site personally every time there was even a minor issue. I stared at the photos, my stomach churning. The documents looked official, complete with dates and signatures, but they described a completely different reality from what had actually happened. Are those fake? I asked. I don't know how he did it, Matthew admitted. But I know what really happened on those job sites. Either Franklin's completely rewritten the project files, or he's created false documentation. Either way, he's building a case that makes it look like you were incompetent the entire time you worked here. The scope of Franklin's manipulation was breathtaking. He wasn't just firing me and badmouthing me to clients, he was systematically falsifying records to support his narrative. If anyone ever investigated my dismissal, they would find a paper trail that made me look like a consistently failing employee who had somehow managed to slip through the cracks for 3 years. Why are you telling me this? I asked Matthew. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground. Because I've seen him do this before, he finally said. There was a project manager about 5 years ago, Richard Robinson. Great guy, really talented. Franklin forced him out using the same tactics. By the time Richard left, Franklin had convinced everyone that Richard was unreliable and difficult to work with. Richard never worked in construction again as far as I know. And you didn't say anything then? I was new, Matthew said defensively. I believed Franklin's version of events. It wasn't until I started working closely with you that I realized how Franklin operates. He's very good at making his victims look like they brought their problems on themselves. The meeting with Matthew left me feeling sick and furious in equal measure. But it also gave me something I desperately needed, proof that Franklin's campaign against me was deliberate and systematic. I wasn't paranoid, and I wasn't imagining the scope of his manipulation. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after my firing, I received a Facebook message from Brittany Johnson, a woman I didn't recognize. Her profile showed she lived 3 states away and worked for a large construction firm. You don't know me, her message began, but I heard through industry contacts about what happened at Cooper Construction. I need to tell you something about Franklin Cooper. We talked on the phone that evening, and Brittany's story made my blood run cold. I was engaged to a guy who worked for Cooper Construction about 6 years ago, she explained. His name was James Martin, and he was a project manager there. Really talented, ambitious guy who thought Franklin was mentoring him. What happened? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Franklin destroyed him, Brittany said simply. It started small. James would mention that Franklin was taking credit for his ideas in meetings, or that he was being excluded from client communications he should have been part of. Then Franklin started questioning James's judgment on projects, overriding his decisions, and creating problems that James would have to fix. The pattern was sickeningly familiar. The final straw came when James brought in a major client through his own networking, Brittany continued. Franklin waited until the contract was signed, then told the client that James was being transferred to internal operations and that Franklin would be their primary contact going forward. When James protested, Franklin accused him of being territorial and unable to work collaboratively. How did it end? Franklin made James's life so miserable that he eventually quit. But that wasn't enough. Franklin spread rumors about James's attitude problems throughout the industry. James couldn't get hired anywhere in the region. He ended up leaving construction entirely and now works in IT. I felt like I was staring into my own future, a future where Franklin's systematic character assassination would follow me wherever I tried to rebuild my career. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because James never fought back, Brittany said. He was so beaten down by the end that he just wanted to escape. He let Franklin win. And for 6 years, I've watched my fiancé, now my husband, struggle with the trauma of having his career destroyed by someone who was supposed to be his mentor. Do you think James would be willing to talk to me? I think he'd be afraid to, Brittany admitted. Franklin's reach is long, and James has finally built a stable career in a different field. But I'll ask him. And Felicity? Whatever you're thinking of doing, whatever Franklin's afraid you might do, please don't let him get away with it. Don't let him do to you what he did to James. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a legal pad, writing down everything I knew about Franklin's pattern of behavior. The list filled 3 pages: systematic credit theft and reputation destruction, falsified documentation and rewritten project history, strategic isolation of targets from colleagues and clients, industry-wide blacklisting through informal network, psychological manipulation and gaslighting, abuse of power to silence witnesses and potential supporters. Franklin Cooper wasn't just a difficult boss or an egomaniacal family patriarch. He was a predator who had spent 20 years perfecting a system for destroying anyone who threatened his authority. And he'd gotten away with it because his victims were too isolated, too damaged, or too afraid to fight back effectively. But as I stared at that list, I realized something that changed everything. For the first time in his career, Franklin had made a critical error. He'd targeted someone who wasn't dependent on him for survival, someone with the resources to fight back, and someone with absolutely nothing left to lose. Franklin Cooper thought he was teaching me about respect and family hierarchy. What he'd actually done was hand me a detailed blueprint of his own destruction. Because while he'd been building his empire of fear and manipulation, I'd been quietly learning how the construction industry really worked, including its weaknesses, its pressure points, and most importantly, how to turn his own methods against him. The war Franklin had declared was about to become very real. And this time, he was going to face someone who understood exactly how he fought, and who was prepared to fight back with surgical precision. He wanted to show me what powerlessness felt like. I was about to show him something much more dangerous. What happens when someone with nothing to lose decides that enough is enough. 3 weeks after learning about Franklin's systematic campaign against me, I found myself sitting on the floor of my living room at 2:47 a.m., surrounded by empty tissue boxes and the scattered pieces of what had once been my life. Christopher was upstairs, sleeping peacefully in our bed, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was having a complete breakdown just one floor below. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. In the darkness, with only the glow of my laptop screen illuminating my tear-stained face, I stared at the job search websites I'd been browsing for hours. Every application I'd submitted had been met with either silence or polite rejections. That felt increasingly hollow as the weeks passed. We've decided to pursue other candidates who more closely match our current needs. While your qualifications are impressive, we're looking for someone with a different background. Thank you for your interest, but we've filled the position internally. The form letters all blended together into a chorus of professional dismissal that felt suspiciously coordinated. Franklin's reach was longer than I'd imagined, and his poison was spreading through the industry faster than I could outrun it. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, looking for someone, anyone, I could talk to about what I was going through. But every name I saw reminded me of how isolated I'd become. My former colleagues at Cooper Construction had gone completely silent. My college friends had their own careers and families to worry about. And my family? God, how could I explain this to my parents? How could I tell them that their daughter, who they'd worked so hard to support through engineering school, had been destroyed by her own father-in-law? The worst part wasn't even the professional destruction, it was the creeping doubt that Franklin had planted in my mind. Late at night, in moments like this, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about my own abilities. Had I really been as good at my job as I thought? Was I remembering my successes correctly, or had I inflated them in my own mind? Maybe Franklin was right. Maybe I had been overwhelmed, incompetent, in over my head. I opened my laptop and pulled up the project files I'd saved to my personal cloud storage, the only evidence I had left of 3 years of work. The Oakdale Medical Center blueprints, the downtown renovation timeline, the cost analysis for the Westfield project. I stared at them through blurry eyes, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with the narrative Franklin was spreading about my incompetence. The numbers didn't lie. Every project I'd managed had been completed on time and under budget. Every client had been satisfied. Every innovation I'd implemented had saved the company money. But somehow, none of that mattered anymore. Franklin had rewritten history so completely that even I was starting to doubt my own memories. My phone buzzed with a text message from Christopher. Can't sleep either? Come to bed. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a mixture of love and resentment that made my chest ache. Christopher, who had sat silent while his father fired me. Christopher, who still believed that family loyalty meant never challenging authority, even when that authority was destroying innocent people. Christopher, who genuinely didn't understand why I couldn't just let it go and move on with my life. I texted back, "Be up soon," but made no move to close my laptop or leave the living room floor. The truth was, I couldn't stand being in the same bed with him right now. Every time I looked at his peaceful, untroubled face, I was reminded of his betrayal. Not the dramatic kind of betrayal you see in movies, but the quiet, insidious betrayal of someone who claims to love you but won't stand up for you when it matters most. We'd had the same argument 5 times over the past 3 weeks, always following the same pattern. "Dad's not trying to hurt you personally," Christopher would say. "He's just protecting the business. You have to understand the position he's in." "The position he's in?" I'd respond. "What about the position I'm in? What about the fact that he's lying about my work, destroying my reputation, making it impossible for me to find another job? Maybe if you hadn't been so confrontational in that board meeting." "Confrontational?" "Christopher, I presented a cost analysis. I was doing my job. But you could have talked to Dad privately first. You could have been more diplomatic. And that's where the conversation would always end, with Christopher suggesting that somehow this was all my fault for not managing Franklin's ego carefully enough. For not being diplomatic enough, submissive enough, grateful enough. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders and opened another job search website, scrolling through listings that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Every posting seemed to require connections I no longer had, references I couldn't provide, or experience in markets that Franklin's influence couldn't reach. My phone rang, startling me in the silence. It was my mother, calling from Thornfield. Felicity? Honey, I'm sorry to call so late, but I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I'm worried about you. I had made the mistake of telling my parents about being fired, though I'd softened the details considerably. I'd told them it was a restructuring and that Franklin felt I needed new challenges. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth, that their daughter's father-in-law had systematically destroyed her career because she dared to suggest improvements to his outdated business practices. I'm fine, Mom, I lied, wiping my nose with a tissue. Just having trouble sleeping. You don't sound fine. You sound like you've been crying. I closed my eyes, pressing my free hand against my forehead. It's just harder than I expected. The job search, I mean. The market is really competitive right now. Have you thought about coming home for a while? Just until you figure things out? Your father and I would love to have you, and maybe some distance from Millbrook Heights would be good for you. The offer was tempting, so tempting that it scared me. I could picture it clearly, retreating to my childhood bedroom, sleeping until noon, helping my mother with library events, pretending that the past 3 years of my professional life had never happened. It would be easy, safe, and completely humiliating. That's really sweet, Mom, but I can't just run away. Christopher's job is here, our house is here. I just need to be patient. What does Christopher think about all this? Is he being supportive? I looked up at the ceiling, toward the bedroom where my husband slept peacefully, unburdened by the knowledge that his father was a monster or that his wife was falling apart. He's processing it in his own way, I said carefully. My mother was quiet for a moment. She'd always been perceptive, and I knew she was reading between the lines of what I wasn't saying. Honey, I know I'm just your old mom, but I've watched you work toward your goals your entire life. I've seen you tackle problems that would have defeated other people. You graduated at the top of your engineering class, you built a successful career from nothing, and you've never given up on anything important to you. This isn't the end of your story. I felt fresh tears starting to fall. What if it is, though? What if Franklin is right? What if I was never as good as I thought I was? Stop. My mother's voice was sharp. Don't you dare let that man make you doubt yourself. I know you, Felicity. I know the work you put in, the standards you hold yourself to. If he fired you, it's because he was threatened by your competence, not because you lacked it. After I hung up with my mother, I sat in the darkness for another hour, staring at the legal pad where I'd written Franklin's methods and tactics. The list had grown to 4 pages as I'd added details from my conversations with former employees and my own memories of his behavior patterns. Franklin Cooper had spent 20 years building a system designed to destroy people like me, people who threatened his authority, people who made him look outdated, people who refused to accept his version of reality. He was very good at what he did, and he'd had decades to perfect his methods, but as I sat there on my living room floor, surrounded by the wreckage of my professional life, I realized something that cut through the despair like a beam of light. Franklin had made one critical error in his assessment of me. He thought he was dealing with James Martin, or Richard Robinson, or any of the other talented people he'd destroyed over the years. He thought he was dealing with someone who would eventually break under the pressure, someone who would give up and slink away quietly rather than continue fighting a battle they couldn't win. What Franklin didn't understand was that he hadn't just fired an employee, he'd fired someone's daughter-in-law. Someone who was supposed to be family. Someone who had trusted him, respected him, and tried to contribute to the legacy he claimed to care so much about. He'd turned what should have been a business disagreement into something deeply personal. And in doing so, he'd given me something that his previous victims had never had, absolutely nothing left to lose. I looked at the time on my laptop screen, 4:23 a.m. In a few hours, Christopher would wake up and get ready for work, kissing me goodbye before heading to the office where his father would continue spreading lies about my incompetence. He would spend his day pretending that nothing had changed, that his family was still intact, that the woman he married was simply going through a rough patch that would eventually resolve itself, but I was done pretending. I was done being the understanding wife, the diplomatic daughter-in-law, the gracious victim who accepted her punishment quietly and moved on with her life. Franklin Cooper wanted to teach me about respect? Fine. He was about to learn that respect was a two-way street, and that some lessons came with a price he'd never imagined paying. I closed my laptop, gathered my tissues and legal pad, and headed upstairs to bed. For the first time in 3 weeks, I felt like I might actually be able to sleep, because tomorrow, I was going to start building something that would make Franklin Cooper rue the day he decided to destroy the wrong woman's life. The emotional devastation was real, but it was also finite. I had hit rock bottom, which meant there was nowhere to go but up. And when I started climbing, Franklin Cooper was going to discover that he'd awakened something in me that he was completely unprepared to handle. The quiet, compliant daughter-in-law was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood exactly how Franklin's system worked, and who was about to use that knowledge to dismantle everything he'd built, piece by piece. The catalyst came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after my firing, in the most unexpected way possible. I was standing in line at the coffee shop near our house, trying to summon the energy to face another day of rejection letters and Christopher's well-meaning but useless advice, when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. "Did you hear about Cooper Construction?" the woman in front of me was saying to her companion. "Apparently they're in some kind of legal trouble." My ears perked up immediately. I moved closer, pretending to study the menu board while straining to hear every word. "What kind of legal trouble?" her friend asked. "Environmental violations, from what I heard. Something about a project where they cut corners on wetland protections. The EPA is investigating, and there might be criminal charges." My blood ran cold. Wetland protections. The Westfield Shopping Center project, my project, was built adjacent to protected wetlands. I had spent weeks coordinating with environmental consultants to ensure we met every regulation, filed every required report, followed every protocol to the letter. I paid for my coffee with shaking hands and practically ran home, my mind racing. The moment I got to my laptop, I started searching for news about Cooper Construction and environmental violations. What I found made my stomach drop. The Millbrook Heights Environmental Coalition had filed a formal complaint with the EPA, alleging that Cooper Construction had submitted falsified environmental impact assessments for the Westfield project. According to the complaint, the original reports had identified significant concerns about wetland disruption, but the final submissions to the city had been altered to minimize these concerns. I stared at the screen in disbelief, then pulled up my own files from the project. I had saved everything to my personal cloud storage, all the original environmental assessments, the consultant reports, the correspondence with regulatory agencies. The timestamps were clear. The reports filed with the city had been changed after I was fired, and Franklin's signature was on the altered documents. Franklin hadn't just destroyed my career, he had used my departure as an opportunity to cut corners on environmental protections, putting the entire project at risk of massive fines and legal action. And now Cooper Construction was facing exactly the kind of scrutiny that could bring down the entire company. I called Matthew Anderson, the site supervisor who had warned me about Franklin's document falsification. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. "Felicity? How are you holding up?" "Matthew, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. The Westfield project, did Franklin make changes to the environmental documentation after I left?" There was a long pause. I probably shouldn't be talking about this over the phone. "Matthew, the EPA is investigating Cooper Construction. If Franklin falsified federal environmental documents, people could go to prison. Not just Franklin, anyone who was involved or who knew about it." Another pause, longer this time. "Can you meet me somewhere?" "Not anywhere public." We met at the same construction site where he'd first warned me about Franklin's tactics. This time, Matthew looked genuinely frightened. "You have to understand," he said before I could even ask my questions, "I've got kids. I can't afford to lose my job or get caught up in some federal investigation." "I understand. But I also need to know what really happened." Matthew ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling with what to tell me. "After you left, Franklin called a meeting with all the site supervisors. He said there had been some miscommunications with the environmental consultants and that he needed to make corrections to the reports before final submission." "What kind of corrections?" "He had us sign off on revised assessments that downplayed the wetland impact. Said the original reports were too conservative and that our actual construction methods had reduced the environmental risks." "But Felicity," he looked around nervously, "we hadn't changed any construction methods. We built exactly according to your original specifications." My heart was pounding. "So Franklin falsified federal environmental documents and made you complicit in it?" "I didn't know they were falsified at the time," Matthew said defensively. "Franklin made it sound like routine corrections based on updated information. It wasn't until the EPA investigation started that I realized what had really happened." "Matthew, Do you still have copies of the original reports? The ones from before Franklin made his corrections? He shook his head. Franklin collected all our copies. Said the company needed to maintain a single set of official records. But I had copies. I had everything. Every original report, every consultant recommendation, every piece of documentation that proved Franklin had systematically falsified federal environmental assessments. And I was the only person outside of Cooper Construction who had access to these records. That evening, I sat in my home office and spread out everything I had: the original environmental assessments, the project timelines, the consultant reports, the correspondence with regulatory agencies. Then I pulled up the news articles about the EPA investigation and started connecting the dots. Franklin had made a catastrophic error. In his eagerness to discredit me and take credit for my work, he had falsified documents that were now subject to federal investigation. The EPA doesn't mess around with environmental fraud. Companies that violate federal environmental laws face fines in the millions of dollars, and executives can face criminal charges. But here's what Franklin didn't know: I had documentary evidence that proved the environmental assessments had been falsified. After my departure, I had timestamped files showing that the original reports were accurate and comprehensive. I had everything needed to prove that Franklin Cooper had committed federal environmental fraud. More importantly, I had evidence that could clear Cooper Construction of wrongdoing. If I chose to share it, for the first time since being fired, I felt something other than despair and rage. I felt power. I picked up my phone and called my college roommate, Sarah, who had gone to law school and now worked for a major firm in the capital. I hadn't spoken to her since my wedding, but she answered on the second ring. Felicity. Oh my God, it's been forever. How are you? Sarah, I need legal advice. Hypothetically, if someone had evidence that could expose environmental fraud but also clear innocent employees of wrongdoing, what would be the best way to present that information? There was a pause. That's very specific. Are we talking about actual fraud or just procedural violations? Federal environmental fraud. Falsified EPA documents, potential criminal charges. Felicity, what the hell is going on? I told her everything. The firing, Franklin's systematic destruction of my reputation, the falsified environmental documents, the EPA investigation. Sarah listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Holy shit, she finally said. Felicity, you're sitting on a nuclear bomb. If you have proof that Cooper Construction's environmental filings were falsified, and you can demonstrate that the falsification happened after your departure, you could potentially save the company while destroying the person responsible. Or I could let the investigation proceed and watch the whole company burn down. Is that what you want? I thought about all the innocent employees at Cooper Construction, people like Matthew, Nicole, Elizabeth, Jennifer. People who had worked hard, built careers, supported families. People who had nothing to do with Franklin's crimes but who would suffer if the company collapsed. Then I thought about Franklin Cooper, sitting in his leather chair, believing he had successfully destroyed another threat to his authority. Believing he had gotten away with it again. No, I said slowly. I don't want to watch innocent people suffer. But I do want Franklin Cooper to face consequences for what he's done. Not just to me, but to everyone he's hurt over the past 20 years. Then, you need a strategy, Sarah said. You need to be very careful about how you present this information and what you want to achieve. Because once you blow the whistle on federal environmental fraud, there's no going back. After I hung up with Sarah, I sat in my office for another hour, thinking about what I wanted to accomplish. Franklin had spent decades building his empire on fear, intimidation, and the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened him. He had gotten away with it because his victims were isolated, powerless, and too damaged to fight back effectively, but this time was different. This time, he had committed a federal crime, and I had the evidence to prove it. This time, I wasn't just a disgruntled former employee with a personal grudge, I was a whistleblower with documented proof of serious legal violations. Franklin Cooper thought he had destroyed me. What he had actually done was give me the tools to destroy him. I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing, Environmental Fraud Documentation, Cooper Construction Westfield Project. For the next 3 hours, I methodically organized every piece of evidence I had, creating a comprehensive timeline that showed exactly how and when Franklin had falsified the environmental assessments. I cross-referenced the original consultant reports with the filed documents, highlighted the discrepancies, and documented the timeline of changes. When I was finished, I had a 47-page report that could single-handedly bring down Franklin Cooper, while protecting the innocent employees who had been manipulated into complicity. But I wasn't ready to turn it over to the EPA yet. First, I needed to understand exactly how the construction industry in Millbrook Heights worked, who the key players were, and how I could use Franklin's own methods against him. Franklin Cooper had taught me that power in the construction industry wasn't just about technical competence or financial resources, it was about relationships, reputation, and the ability to control information. He was about to learn that I had been a very good student. The war he had declared was about to begin in earnest. And this time, I would be fighting with weapons he had never faced before: federal environmental law, documentary evidence, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The first person I contacted was James Martin, Brittany Johnson's husband, Franklin's victim from 6 years ago. I found his IT company online and called the main number, asking to speak with him about consulting opportunities in the construction industry. When James got on the phone, his voice was cautious. "I'm sorry, but I don't work in construction anymore. You might have the wrong person." "Mr. Martin, my name is Felicity Adams. I was recently employed at Cooper Construction, and I believe you and I have some shared experiences with Franklin Cooper." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When James finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't talk about that. I'm sorry, but I really can't get involved in anything related to Franklin or Cooper Construction." "Mr. Martin, I completely understand your reluctance. But I need you to know that Franklin is currently under federal investigation for environmental fraud. I have evidence that could bring him down permanently, but I need to understand the full scope of his pattern of behavior. I'm not asking you to do anything that puts you at risk, I just need to know what really happened to you." Another long pause. "Brittany said you might call. Look, I really don't want to relive all of that. It took me years to rebuild my career and my confidence." "I understand. But James, if we don't stop him, he's going to keep destroying people. Right now, he's probably targeting his next victim. Someone else is sitting where you sat 6 years ago, thinking they're crazy, thinking they're imagining the systematic undermining of their work and reputation." James was quiet for a moment. "What kind of evidence do you have?" I spent the next hour walking James through everything: the environmental fraud, the falsified documents, Franklin's systematic destruction of my reputation, the pattern I'd identified through conversations with other former employees. When I finished, James was silent for a long time. "Jesus," he finally said. "The environmental fraud, that's a federal crime. People go to prison for that." "Exactly. And I have all the documentation to prove it. But I want to make sure that when this comes out, it's comprehensive. I want to document Franklin's entire pattern of behavior so that everyone understands this wasn't an isolated incident." "What do you need from me?" "Everything you can remember about what Franklin did to you. Dates, specific incidents, any documentation you might still have. And I need you to help me find other victims." Over the next 2 weeks, James became my most valuable ally. Despite his initial reluctance, the opportunity to finally expose Franklin Cooper seemed to awaken something in him. He helped me track down 3 other former Cooper Construction employees who had been driven out using Franklin's methods. Richard Robinson, the project manager Matthew had mentioned, was working as a facilities manager for a school district 2 states away. When I called him, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "Franklin Cooper is the reason I can't sleep through the night," he said without preamble. "It's been 5 years, and I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about what he did to me." Richard had kept everything: emails, project files, even recordings of some of his meetings with Franklin. "I thought I might need them for a lawsuit someday," he explained. "But my lawyer said it would be impossible to prove, and Franklin's connections made it too risky to pursue." Through Richard, I found Angela Foster, a former site manager who had been pushed out after questioning Franklin's safety protocols. Angela had documentation showing that Franklin had retaliated against her for reporting OSHA violations, eventually forcing her out of the industry entirely. And through Angela, I found Dr. Miles Taylor, an environmental consultant who had worked with Cooper Construction for several years before Franklin abruptly terminated their relationship. Dr. Taylor had suspected that his reports were being altered, but he'd never had proof. "I stopped working with Cooper Construction because I couldn't risk my professional reputation," Dr. Taylor told me. "But I always wondered what Franklin was doing with my assessments after I submitted them." When I showed Dr. Taylor the evidence of Franklin's document falsification, his reaction was swift and decisive. "This is exactly what I suspected," he said, pointing to the altered environmental reports. "Look here, this section about wetland mitigation has been completely rewritten. The original language was much more cautious, much more specific about monitoring requirements. Franklin changed it to make it sound like the environmental risks were minimal." Dr. Taylor agreed to provide an expert analysis of the document alterations, creating a detailed comparison that would be invaluable for the federal investigation, but gathering evidence was only part of my strategy. I also needed to understand the current dynamics within Cooper Construction and the broader Millbrook Heights construction industry. I reached out to Lydia Perry, a project manager at Taylor Enterprises, Cooper Construction's main competitor. Lydia and I had met at several industry conferences, and I suspected she might have insights into Cooper Construction's recent struggles. Felicity, I heard you'd left Cooper Construction. How are you enjoying your break from the industry? I chose my words carefully. Actually, I'm exploring new opportunities. I've been hearing some interesting things about how the market is shifting, especially with all the new environmental regulations. Oh, you mean the EPA investigation? Lydia's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Everyone in the industry is talking about it. Word is that Cooper Construction might be facing some serious legal problems. What kind of problems? Environmental fraud, from what I hear. My boss is already reaching out to some of Cooper Construction's clients, suggesting they might want to consider alternative contractors while the investigation is ongoing. This was exactly the kind of information I needed. Franklin's legal troubles were already affecting Cooper Construction's business relationships. Clients were getting nervous, competitors were circling, and Franklin's carefully constructed reputation was beginning to crumble. I spent the next week systematically mapping the relationships and power dynamics within the Millbrook Heights construction industry. I identified key clients who might be vulnerable to Franklin's influence, contractors who depended on Cooper Construction for work, and industry leaders who had the power to affect Franklin's reputation. Most importantly, I identified the pressure points, the relationships and contracts that Franklin couldn't afford to lose. The Westfield Shopping Center project was just the beginning. I discovered that Cooper Construction was currently working on 2 other major projects with significant environmental components, a residential development near Millbrook Lake and a commercial complex that required extensive wetland permits. If Franklin had falsified documents for one environmental assessment, it was likely he had done it for others. And if I could prove a pattern of environmental fraud across multiple projects, the legal consequences would be catastrophic. I contacted Dr. Taylor again and asked him to review the environmental documentation for Cooper Construction's other active projects. Within days, he confirmed my suspicions. It's the same pattern, he told me. Environmental risks systematically downplayed, monitoring requirements reduced, mitigation measures minimized. If these are the documents that were filed with regulatory agencies, Franklin Cooper has committed environmental fraud on at least 3 federal projects. By the end of the month, I had assembled a coalition of allies that Franklin could never have anticipated: former employees with detailed knowledge of his methods, environmental experts who could prove his fraud, industry contacts who understood the broader implications of his crimes, and most importantly, a lawyer who specialized in federal environmental law. Sarah had connected me with Robert White, a federal prosecutor who had spent his career pursuing environmental crimes. When I presented my evidence to him, his reaction was immediate and decisive. Ms. Adams, this is one of the most comprehensive cases of systematic environmental fraud I've seen in my career. If this documentation is authentic and preliminary review suggests it is, Franklin Cooper is looking at serious federal charges. What kind of charges? Conspiracy to defraud the United States, violations of the Clean Water Act, potentially criminal fraud depending on the financial impact. We're talking about potential prison time, not just fines. But Robert also warned me about the risks I was taking. You need to understand that once we move forward with this, there's no going back. Franklin Cooper has connections, resources, and a reputation for destroying people who cross him. If he figures out what you're doing before we're ready to move, he could make your life very difficult. He's already made my life very difficult, I replied. The difference is that now I have the tools to fight back. That evening, I sat in my home office and looked at the wall where I'd mapped out Franklin's network of relationships, his pattern of crimes, and the evidence I'd gathered. After 6 weeks of systematic investigation, I had everything I needed to bring down Franklin Cooper permanently, but I also had something else: a clear understanding of how the construction industry in Millbrook Heights really worked. I understood the relationships, the pressure points, and the opportunities. Franklin Cooper had spent 20 years building his empire by destroying anyone who threatened him. But in destroying me, he had created someone who understood his methods better than anyone else, and who was now positioned to use those methods against him with devastating precision. The student had become the teacher. And class was about to begin. 2 months after my firing, I stood in front of a whiteboard in the small office I'd rented across town, looking at the most sophisticated plan I'd ever developed. It wasn't a construction project this time, it was the systematic demolition of Franklin Cooper's entire empire. The plan had 3 phases, each designed to use Franklin's own methods against him with surgical precision. Phase 1, the pressure Campaign federal prosecutor Robert White had agreed to delay filing charges for 6 weeks to give me time to gather additional evidence and coordinate with other regulatory agencies. This wasn't just about environmental fraud anymore. I discovered violations spanning workplace safety, tax reporting, and federal contracting regulations, but the delay served another purpose. It gave me time to apply pressure that would force Franklin to make increasingly desperate mistakes. I started with the clients. Using the industry connections I'd developed through Lydia Perry, I began a subtle campaign to make Cooper Construction's major clients nervous about their ongoing projects. Not through direct contact, that would have been too obvious, but through carefully placed questions and concerns raised by concerned industry professionals. Dr. Miles Taylor reached out to his contacts at the EPA and other environmental consulting firms, expressing concerns about the Westfield project and suggesting they might want to take a closer look at Cooper Construction's other environmental assessments. Within days, Cooper Construction received notice that their Millbrook Lake residential project would require additional environmental review. Angela Foster, working through her contacts at OSHA, arranged 4 routine safety inspections at 3 Cooper Construction job sites. The inspections found multiple violations that had existed for months but had never been properly documented or addressed. Each incident individually was manageable, but collectively, they created a pattern of regulatory scrutiny that made Cooper Construction look increasingly unreliable to their clients and partners. Phase 2, the reputation assault. While regulatory pressure mounted, I launched the second phase, systematically undermining Franklin's carefully cultivated reputation within the industry. James Martin had kept detailed records of his own destruction, including emails and notes from meetings where Franklin had badmouthed him to industry contacts. Using this as a template, I began documenting Franklin's pattern of character assassination and sharing it strategically with key industry leaders. I prepared detailed dossiers on Franklin's treatment of female employees, his pattern of taking credit for others' work, and his systematic destruction of talented employees who threatened his authority. But I didn't distribute these widely. Instead, I shared them with a carefully selected group of influential women in the construction industry. Teresa Dixon, the head of the Regional Construction Association, was particularly receptive. "I've been hearing whispers about Franklin Cooper for years," she told me during a confidential meeting. But no one ever had the documentation to back up their concerns. Within weeks, Franklin found himself excluded from industry committees he'd served on for years. Speaking engagements were quietly withdrawn. The Chamber of Commerce board began asking pointed questions about Cooper Construction's recent regulatory troubles. Franklin's response was entirely predictable. He doubled down on his controlling behavior, becoming more aggressive in his attempts to manage Cooper Construction's reputation. He began micromanaging client relationships, taking personal control of all external communications, and demanding that employees report any contact with competitors or regulatory agencies. This was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Phase 3. The trap. The final phase required the most delicate coordination. I needed Franklin to commit a federal crime in front of witnesses while federal investigators were in position to document it. Working with Robert White, I arranged for an undercover EPA investigator to approach Cooper Construction about a major commercial development project, a project that would require extensive environmental assessment and federal permitting. The investigator, posing as a developer named Joseph Thompson, specifically requested a proposal for a project that would require wetland mitigation and comprehensive environmental documentation. The project was designed to be exactly the kind of high-pressure, high-value contract that would tempt Franklin to cut corners. But here's where the plan got sophisticated. I arranged for Joseph Thompson to specifically mention that he'd heard Cooper Construction was efficient with environmental permitting and that he needed a contractor who could work within the system to get approvals quickly. It was a subtle invitation to environmental fraud, delivered in the kind of language that Franklin had used himself when pressuring consultants to minimize environmental concerns. To make the trap irresistible, Joseph Thompson also mentioned that Taylor Enterprises, Cooper Construction's main competitor, had already submitted a proposal for the project, but that he preferred to work with Cooper Construction if they could match Taylor's timeline and costs. Franklin took the bait completely. Within days of receiving the proposal request, Franklin contacted Dr. Taylor directly, pressuring him to provide preliminary environmental assessments that would support an aggressive development timeline. When Dr. Taylor refused, Franklin fired him and brought in a less scrupulous consulting firm. But here's what Franklin didn't know. Dr. Taylor was now working with federal investigators, and every conversation with Franklin was being recorded. The new consulting firm Franklin hired was also compromised. One of their senior staff members was Robert Robinson, Richard Robinson's brother, who had agreed to help build the case against Franklin after learning what had happened to his brother. Through Robert Robinson, I was able to monitor every aspect of Franklin's approach to the Thompson project. As predicted, Franklin began pressuring the consultants to minimize environmental concerns, suggesting specific language that would downplay wetland impacts and reduce monitoring requirements. Everything was being documented. Every conversation, every email, every request for document modification was being recorded by federal investigators, but the masterstroke came when Franklin, growing frustrated with the pace of the environmental assessment, decided to take matters into his own hands. In a meeting with the consulting team, a meeting that federal investigators were monitoring in real time, Franklin explicitly instructed them to alter their preliminary findings to make the project more attractive to regulators. "Look," he said, unaware that his words were being recorded, "I've been dealing with environmental bureaucrats for 20 years. They don't need to know every detail. They just need to see that we're checking the boxes. Simplify the language, reduce the monitoring requirements, and focus on the economic benefits." When the lead consultant pointed out that altering environmental assessments could violate federal law, Franklin's response was captured perfectly on tape: "Only if someone reports it. And who's going to do that? Everyone working on this project has a stake in seeing it succeed." It was a textbook case of conspiracy to commit environmental fraud, captured on federal recording equipment, with multiple witnesses present. But I wasn't finished yet. The final element of the trap required perfect timing. I needed Franklin to submit the falsified environmental assessment to federal regulators while investigators were prepared to make arrests immediately. Working through Joseph Thompson, I created a sense of urgency around the project timeline. Thompson began pressuring Franklin for faster permitting, suggesting that competing projects were moving ahead more quickly. Franklin, desperate to secure the contract and prove that Cooper Construction could still compete effectively, expedited the environmental submission process. On a Tuesday morning in late November, Franklin personally delivered the falsified environmental assessment to the EPA regional office. Federal agents were waiting. As Franklin walked out of the EPA building, believing he had successfully submitted another fraudulent environmental assessment, he was arrested on federal charges of conspiracy to defraud the United States, violations of the Clean Water Act, and environmental fraud. The arrest was captured by news cameras that had been tipped off by sources within the prosecutor's office. By noon, every local news outlet was running footage of Franklin Cooper being led away in handcuffs, but the real beauty of the plan wasn't just Franklin's arrest, it was what happened next. With Franklin in custody and Cooper Construction under federal investigation, the company's clients began demanding immediate reassurance about their ongoing projects. The board of directors, faced with potential criminal liability, demanded a complete audit of all environmental documentation, and I was ready for them, because while Franklin had been walking into my trap, I had been positioning myself for the next phase, not just destroying Franklin Cooper, but building something better in his place. The war was almost over. But the most satisfying victory was yet to come. Franklin Cooper's downfall came faster than even I had anticipated. 3 days after his arrest, he posted bail and immediately demanded an emergency meeting with Cooper Construction's board of directors. What he didn't know was that I would be there waiting for him. The board had hired me as an independent consultant to conduct a comprehensive audit of all environmental and safety compliance issues. When Franklin walked into the conference room that Thursday morning, expecting to control the narrative as he had done countless times before, he found me sitting at the head of the table with a stack of evidence that represented 20 years of his crimes. "What the hell is she doing here?" Franklin snarled, pointing at me with a trembling finger. His usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced by the wild-eyed desperation of a man who finally understood he'd been outmaneuvered. Roland Burke, the senior board member, looked up from the preliminary audit report I'd provided. "Ms. Adams is here because she's the only person who can help us understand the full scope of our potential liability." "Franklin, sit down. We need to talk." "I'm not sitting in the same room as that vindictive." "Sit down." Roland's voice cut through Franklin's protests like ice. "Unless you want us to terminate your employment immediately and cooperate fully with federal prosecutors." Franklin sat, but his eyes never left mine. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how I had orchestrated his destruction. The man who had spent decades crushing other people was finally experiencing what it felt like to be powerless. "Franklin," I said, my voice calm and professional, "the federal investigation has uncovered systematic environmental fraud spanning at least 7 projects over the past 3 years. They have recordings of you explicitly instructing consultants to falsify federal environmental assessments." His face went pale. "Those recordings are taken out of context. I was simply trying to expedite the permitting process by committing federal crimes," I interrupted. "But that's not all we found." I opened the first folder and spread out documents across the conference table. We also found evidence of systematic employee harassment, fraudulent billing practices, and OSHA violations that you covered up to avoid regulatory scrutiny. Franklin's lawyer, Arthur Watson, leaned forward. Ms. Adams, my client has constitutional rights. Your client has been systematically destroying people's careers for 2 decades, I said, pulling out another folder. James Martin, Richard Robinson, Angela Foster, Megan Smith, Joshua Williams, Andrew Jackson. Should I continue? I watched Franklin's face as I read each name. With every victim I listed, he seemed to shrink a little more in his chair. Each of these people has provided sworn statements detailing your pattern of retaliation, character assassination, and workplace abuse. The federal prosecutors are very interested in establishing a pattern of criminal behavior. This is a witch hunt, Franklin said, but his voice had lost all its authority. You're bitter about being fired, so you've manufactured this entire— I didn't manufacture anything, Franklin. I stood up and walked around the table until I was directly in front of him. I simply documented what you did. Every falsified record, every destroyed career, every life you ruined to protect your fragile ego. For the first time since I'd known him, Franklin Cooper looked genuinely afraid. The difference between you and me, I continued, is that when you destroyed people, you did it in darkness, through lies and manipulation. When I brought you down, I did it with truth, documentation, and federal law enforcement. Roland Burke cleared his throat. Franklin, the board has voted. Your employment with Cooper Construction is terminated effective immediately. Your severance package is forfeit due to the criminal charges, and will be cooperating fully with federal investigators. Franklin's composure finally cracked completely. You can't do this to me. I built this company. Without me, you're nothing. Without you, I said quietly, this company might actually have a future. As security escorted Franklin from the building, the same security team that had walked me out 4 months earlier, he turned back one last time. This isn't over, he said, his voice filled with impotent rage. I smiled. Yes, Franklin. It is. 18 months after that first day in Franklin's office, I stood in my own office, the CEO suite at Adams Construction Solutions, the company I'd built from the ground up while Franklin Cooper sat in federal prison. Franklin's sentencing had been swift and decisive. 3 years for conspiracy to defraud the United States, 2 years for environmental fraud, and 5 years for racketeering related to his systematic destruction of employees' careers. The federal judge had been particularly harsh about the pattern of workplace retaliation, calling it a decades-long campaign of professional terrorism. Cooper Construction had survived, but barely. The board hired me as interim CEO while they restructured the company under new management. We implemented every modern practice Franklin had resisted: digital project management, transparent environmental protocols, and most importantly, a zero-tolerance policy for workplace harassment and retaliation. But I had bigger plans. Using a portion of the whistleblower settlement I'd received from the federal environmental case, I launched Adams Construction Solutions with a radical mission: to prove that construction companies could be profitable, ethical, and employee-focused simultaneously. We hired James Martin as our head of project management. Angela Foster became our safety director. Dr. Miles Taylor joined as our environmental compliance officer. Every person Franklin had tried to destroy found a place in our company, and together we built something he never could have imagined. Within a year, we'd secured contracts worth $12 million, including the renovation of Millbrook Heights' new municipal complex, the same project Franklin had tried to win through fraud. Our employee satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry, our safety record was spotless, and our environmental compliance was held up as a model by federal regulators. But the most satisfying victory wasn't financial, it was cultural. The Franklin Cooper case had sparked a broader conversation about workplace abuse in the construction industry. The Regional Construction Association implemented new reporting mechanisms for retaliation and harassment. 3 other executives across the region were investigated and fired for similar patterns of behavior. Most importantly, we'd established the Cooper Foundation, named ironically after Franklin's company, to provide legal support and career assistance for construction industry employees facing workplace retaliation. My phone still rings weekly with calls from people sharing their own Franklin Cooper stories. Engineers who've been marginalized, project managers who've had their work stolen, safety officers who've been fired for reporting violations. Each one gets the same response: documentation, legal support, and if necessary, a job offer. Last month, I ran into Christopher at the grocery store. Our divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, amicable but inevitable. He looked tired, older, diminished by his father's fall and his own complicity in it. "How are you doing?" he asked, and I could see genuine regret in his eyes. "I'm building something better," I told him. Something your father never could have imagined. He nodded slowly. I should have stood up for you. Yes, I said simply. You should have. Some stories don't have neat endings where everyone learns their lesson and lives happily ever after. Christopher will live with his choices, just as Franklin will live with his consequences. But the story that matters, the story of standing up to abuse, of refusing to be diminished, of building something better from the ashes of destruction, that story continues every day. If you're watching this and you're facing your own Franklin Cooper, remember this: they seem powerful because they've built their entire identity around making other people feel powerless. But power based on fear and intimidation is ultimately fragile. Truth, integrity, and persistence are stronger than any bullies. Network or reputation, document everything. Find allies. Trust the evidence. And never, ever let anyone convince you that you deserve less than respect and dignity in your workplace. Hit that subscribe button if this story inspired you, and drop a comment sharing your own experiences with workplace bullies. Together, we can make sure that people like Franklin Cooper learn that their days of destroying careers with impunity are over, because in the end, integrity doesn't just win, it builds something better than what came before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.